The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, enjoying the silence for hours, but now something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite, deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life, birds, insects, something. But the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV, where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique one I'd brought along to mess around with during my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing, until now. I stood up from the fire, walking over to the RV and ducking inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers, 13789. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment, then the numbers started again. 137. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere. Maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing, I was sure. But the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong. Like the message wasn't for just anyone. Like it was for me. I shut the radio off, my fingers trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods, the towering pines looming overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back, 1378. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, made me uneasy. I stepped back outside, trying to push the growing sense of unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weathered jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. I heard it too. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal. The numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. "You've heard it too?" The man nodded. "I'm Ben," he said, stepping closer. His voice was low. "I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. My cell phone drained to 0 in minutes." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What do you think it is?" Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. "I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer. I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals, glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 137. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes were constantly scanning the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. You think it's some kind of broadcast? I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. I don't think it's a broadcast at all. What do you mean? He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. I think it's a warning or a signal from something out there. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask more, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. Then, through the radio, a voice crackled to life. We see you. My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. What the hell was that? He whispered. I could barely whisper back, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. We see you. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical. We see you. I stood up, flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. I think we should leave, Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once I agreed. The next morning, I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no note. Just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles, the battery draining faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 137. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected. An old, dilapidated radio tower, hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small glowing device, pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, all crashed into me at once in an unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower, as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, as if something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. The lights followed me, the clicking never far behind, but I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper. Even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror, it didn't stop. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 137. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am. And it's not done with me yet. We thought we knew the Ozarks. Matt swore up and down that Mark Twain National Forest was a hidden gem, untouched trails, beautiful vistas, perfect for a 3-day backpacking trip. He was always good at selling these kinds of trips, making it seem like a dream adventure. I believed him mostly because I loved him, but even then, As we parked the car at the trailhead and unloaded our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was going to be different. Looks like we're in for some real wilderness this time, Kyle said, flashing a grin. He was already making jokes about getting lost and being eaten by cryptids. Classic Kyle, always trying to lighten the mood. I laughed it off, but something about the dense trees and the isolation made the joke sit heavy in my chest. The forest felt too quiet, too vast. Matt, as usual, was all business. He was adjusting his pack, double-checking the map on his phone. "We'll follow the GPS for most of the way," he said, his voice filled with confidence. "Should be easy. Just a couple of tough climbs, but nothing we can't handle." I glanced at Sarah, who was tightening the straps on her hiking boots. She was always the tough one, competitive, never backing down from a challenge. I liked that about her, but sometimes it felt like she had something to prove, especially when Matt was around. I couldn't tell if it was admiration or rivalry. "Let's get moving," Matt called, waving us on. "We've got a lot of ground to cover." The first day went as expected. We hiked deeper into the forest, leaving behind the marked trails and venturing into the heart of the wilderness. The trees were taller here, their branches heavy with green, creating a canopy that let in only slivers of sunlight. It felt like the forest was swallowing us whole, but Matt pressed on, oblivious to the creeping unease that gnawed at me. That night, we set up camp by a small stream. The air was cooler than I expected, a bite of cold that sank into my bones as the sun set. Kyle's tent had a broken pole, something he hadn't noticed until we tried setting it up. He laughed it off, saying he'd just sleep in Sarah's tent, but Matt's frustration was clear. "Next time, check your gear before we leave," Matt snapped, his voice tight. "Relax, man, it's just a tent pole," Kyle said, but the tension between them simmered. I was too tired to deal with their bickering, so I busied myself with starting the fire. Dana, my girlfriend, snapped photos as always, capturing the last glimmers of daylight filtered through the trees. She looked peaceful behind the camera, but I could tell she felt it too. That sense that something was off. That night, we heard the first howl. It was distant at first, almost like the wind moving through the trees, but then it came again, low and deep, rising into a chilling wail that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "What the hell was that?" Sarah muttered, her hand instinctively moving toward the hatchet strapped to her pack. Matt shrugged, trying to play it off. "Probably just a coyote or something. These woods are full of wildlife." But it didn't sound like any coyote I'd ever heard. I exchanged a glance with Dana, and she raised her eyebrows in that way she did when she didn't believe something. Kyle, of course, took the opportunity to joke. "Sounds like Bigfoot's out there. Or maybe the Ozark Howler," he said, his voice teasing. "You guys know that one, right? Big hairy creature, glowing red eyes, hunts hikers for fun." "Knock it off," Matt said sharply. "It's just an animal. Get some sleep. We've got a long hike tomorrow." I tried to brush it off too, but lying in our tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig outside made my heart race. I must have drifted off at some point, but it was restless sleep. The next morning, Dana told me she'd seen something outside the tent, just for a second, but she was sure of it. Red eyes. "I saw red eyes, Matt," she said softly. I laughed nervously, thinking she must have been half asleep. "Maybe it was just a trick of the light," I said, though even I didn't believe it. I hadn't told anyone about the dreams I'd had, the sensation of being watched, hunted, like we were intruding on something that didn't want us there. Day 2 was worse. The forest grew denser, the path less defined, and the GPS signal flickered in and out. At one point, we lost it completely. Matt insisted he could still navigate using the map, but the landscape wasn't matching up with anything. The trees felt wrong. Closer somehow, like they were moving in on us. The air grew colder, and the silence pressed down like a weight. "We're lost," Sarah said flatly, glaring at Matt. "We're not lost," he snapped back. "I know where we are." But he didn't. None of us did. That night, we found claw marks on the trees, deep gouges, like something had raked through the bark with claws far larger than any animal should have. Dana's hands trembled as she took pictures, but Matt dismissed it. "Could be a bear," he said, though the unease in his voice was obvious. "That's not a bear," Kyle muttered, his earlier joking tone gone. He stared at the claw marks, his face pale. "This is messed up, man. Maybe we should turn back." "We're not turning back," Matt said, his voice rising. "We've come this far. We stick to the plan." The argument that followed was inevitable. Sarah sided with Kyle, saying we were unprepared and it wasn't worth the risk. Dana stayed quiet, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Matt, stubborn as ever, refused to admit we were in over our heads. We set up camp again that night, and the howling returned. This time it was closer, louder, the sound reverberating through the trees like something was circling us. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamt of those red eyes watching us from the darkness. In the morning, we found more signs. Animal carcasses torn apart, strewn across the ground. Deer, mostly, their bodies mangled in ways that didn't make sense. No predator would kill like that, not for food. It was like something had ripped them apart for fun. Kyle was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "It's the howler, man. I'm telling you, this place is messed up." Matt, as always, refused to believe it. "It's just a predator. Wolves, maybe." "There are no wolves in the Ozarks," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Not anymore." We kept moving, but the howls followed us, louder, closer. By late afternoon, we knew we weren't alone. We were being hunted. It was just before dusk when we saw it. We stopped to rest, setting our packs down near a small clearing. That's when Dana froze, her camera slipping from her hands. "Matt," she whispered, "behind you." I turned just in time to see it step out of the trees, hulking, shadowy, with glowing red eyes that burned through the dim light. Its body was massive, covered in thick dark fur, but its shape was wrong, twisted, like something caught between animal and something more. The howl that followed was like nothing I'd ever heard, a deep, guttural sound that shook me to my core. It didn't charge, it didn't attack, it just stood there, watching, as if daring us to move. We didn't. "What the hell is that?" Kyle's voice was barely a whisper, his face drained of color. "It's not real," Matt muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Dana grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling now. The creature tilted its head, almost curious, its red eyes glowing brighter. Then, with one last bone-chilling howl, it slipped back into the trees. We didn't wait to see if it would return. We packed up in record time and started moving fast. Too fast. The light was fading, and we were stumbling over roots and rocks, our breath coming in short, panicked gasps. That night, we didn't set up camp, we just kept walking, desperate to put distance between us and whatever that thing was. The howls continued, closer, always closer. When dawn finally broke, we stumbled upon an old ranger's cabin. Its roof caved in, the windows shattered. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. We collapsed inside, too exhausted to keep going. For the first time in hours, the howling stopped. Matt stared at the floor, his face pale, his hands shaking. "It's not real," he whispered over and over again like a broken record. But we knew better. We had heard it, seen it. The Ozark Howler was real, and it had let us live. For now. As we sat in that ruined cabin, the forest watching, waiting, I realized we hadn't escaped. Not really. The Howler was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, and it was only a matter of time before it came back. It was still dark when I arrived at Devil's Tower. The silhouette of the monolith rose above the horizon like a jagged alien structure. The first light of dawn barely touched the sky, but the outline was unmistakable. This place had always felt otherworldly, as if it didn't belong to the same earth the rest of us walked on. I parked the RV in the farthest corner of the campground, away from the few other visitors scattered throughout the park. I wanted isolation, needed it, actually, after months of losing myself in work and failing to fix my crumbling marriage. I thought this trip might offer me some clarity. If nothing else, I had my research to keep me focused. Legends of Devil's Tower had fascinated me for years, but one in particular always stuck out: the legend of the Watcher. Native tribes in the region spoke of a spirit that guarded the tower, a being that offered ancient knowledge to those who sought it, but demanded a steep price in return. As a history professor obsessed with ancient folklore, I couldn't resist the lure of that story. I had come to Wyoming to dig deeper into those legends, hoping to uncover something, anything, that might be hiding in the shadows of the tower. I stepped out of the RV, the crisp morning air biting at my skin. The towering spires of pine trees loomed around me, creating an unsettling sense of isolation. I unpacked my gear, set up camp, and grabbed my notebook. The plan was simple: hike around the base of the tower, take some notes, and maybe, just maybe, find something that would finally make all the pieces click. As I set out toward the trail that led to the tower, I passed an older man in a park ranger uniform, grizzled with deep lines etched into his face. His eyes were sharp, though, alert in a way that made me feel like he saw more than the average person. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "Morning," I replied, glancing briefly at his name tag. "Tom, you here for the sights or something else?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. I hesitated. "Research, mostly. I'm looking into some of the old Native American stories about the tower." He nodded slowly, his gaze flicking toward Devil's Tower. "The Watcher, huh?" I stopped. I hadn't mentioned that specific legend. He chuckled softly. "Everyone comes looking for something, but you'd do well to leave the Watcher alone, son. Some things don't like being disturbed." I tried to brush off his warning with a nervous laugh. "You don't really believe that, do you, Tom?" He didn't smile. "Doesn't matter what I believe. Just be careful. People who go digging too deep around here sometimes find more than they bargain for." With that, he turned and walked back toward the ranger station, leaving me standing there with a pit forming in my stomach. I told myself it was just local superstition, the kind of thing park rangers said to spook tourists. But as I turned my eyes back to the tower, the weight of his words lingered. By midday, I was deep into my hike, circling the base of the tower, taking notes on the surrounding landscape. The towering rock formation loomed overhead, casting long shadows over the forest below. I felt dwarfed by it, like a child standing at the feet of a giant. That's when I noticed the eyes. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a glimmer of sunlight catching on something in the trees. But then I saw them again, faint, glowing orbs between the branches. They were high up, too high to be an animal, and they followed my every movement. I stopped walking, my heart pounding. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just hovered there, watching. I wanted to dismiss them as some kind of wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind them, something intelligent. Forcing myself to continue, I kept walking, occasionally glancing over my shoulder to see if the eyes were still there. They were always just far enough away to keep me wondering, but close enough that I could feel their presence. When I finally made it back to camp, the unease hadn't left me. I sat by the RV, trying to write in my notebook, but my mind kept drifting back to the eyes in the trees, the way they'd followed me, never straying too far, but never coming closer either. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the campground in shadow. The tower loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the purple sky. The fire I'd started crackled weakly, the flames flickering as if they, too, were uncertain about staying here. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I was a rational man, after all, a professor, a skeptic. But as the night wore on, that skepticism started to feel more like denial. The wind rustled through the trees, and the fire guttered low. Then, just as the last light of the day faded, I heard it. A whistle. It started softly, almost like the wind, but it was too distinct, too deliberate, a single, drawn-out note that drifted through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood, scanning the darkness. The fire cast faint light around the camp. "Hello?" I called, though I wasn't sure what I expected to hear in return. The whistle came again, sharper this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam into the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, just the oppressive stillness of the forest. The whistling stopped, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than before. I sat back down, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of the trees made me bolt upright, expecting to see those glowing eyes or hear that eerie whistle again. I told myself it was just my imagination, just nerves from being out here alone. But the uneasy feeling stuck with me, settling deep in my bones. The next day, I set out again, hoping to shake the paranoia that had settled over me. I hadn't gone far when I ran into Julie, a solo traveler I'd briefly noticed the day before. She was standing at the edge of the trail, staring up at Devil's Tower, a strange look on her face. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said as I approached, though her tone didn't match her words. There was something off about the way she spoke, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. Yeah, I replied. I've been hiking around, looking into the old legends. You know about the Watcher? She turned to me, a slow smile spreading across her face. The Watcher? You're looking for it? I nodded, uneasy. It's just research. Julie's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. The Watcher doesn't like to be found. You know it watches, but it doesn't want to be seen. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about her was wrong. She seemed too calm, too knowing. The way she stared at me made my skin crawl. Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked back toward her campsite, leaving me standing there, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, the whistling returned, louder this time, persistent. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight, eyes darting between the trees. The whistle circled the campsite, moving closer then further away, like it was testing me, toying with me. Then, just beyond the flickering light of the fire, I saw him. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the woods. His face was pale, hollow-eyed, and his mouth was pursed as the tuneless whistle drifted from his lips. My throat tightened. "Who are you?" I asked. The figure didn't answer. He just stood there, whistling that same eerie note. My chest tightened with a sudden surge of panic. I stumbled back toward the RV, tripping over a rock and falling to the ground. When I looked up, he was gone. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me. The sound of my breath was too loud in the confined space. The next morning, I found footprints around the campsite. Small indentations in the dirt, leading in circles around the fire. They hadn't been there before. On the final night, I couldn't take it anymore. The dreams of Devil's Tower had become unbearable, nightmares of the stone pulsing, breathing like a living thing. I dreamt of eyes, hundreds of them, watching me from the shadows, always watching. I had to go to the tower. I had to see it up close. I grabbed my gear and set out under the cover of darkness, the whistle guiding me, pulling me toward the monolith. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The stars above twisted and shifted, unfamiliar constellations blinking in and out of existence. As I neared the base of the tower, I saw her again. Julie, standing at the foot of the rock, her face pale and her smile too wide. "The Watcher is waiting," she whispered. "It's always been waiting." The whistle grew louder, piercing through my thoughts, driving me forward. I reached the tower, my hands trembling as I touched the cold stone. And then, out of the shadows, the Watcher appeared. It was a massive shadowy figure, its body indistinguishable from the darkness, but its eyes, glowing, burning orbs that stared into me, through me. It didn't speak with words, but its presence filled my mind, offering me ancient knowledge, secrets of the tower, of the universe, of myself. But the price, I could feel it gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The more I listened, the more I realized that accepting its offer would mean losing everything. My mind, my soul, everything that made me, me. I stumbled back, tearing myself away from the Watcher's gaze. The whistle reached a fever pitch, and I ran. The ground beneath me shifted and warped as the world collapsed around me. I barely made it back to the RV. When I crossed the threshold, the whistling stopped. The forest fell silent. I drove away as the first light of dawn touched the sky. The image of the Watcher's eyes burned into my mind. I knew I would never be the same. I've never been a superstitious man. Ghosts, spirits, curses, all of it felt like nonsense. My wife, Sarah, was the opposite. She loved all that mystical, spiritual stuff. She'd go on and on about how some places had energies or how she could feel something otherworldly when we'd visit a new place. I used to tease her for it. I didn't mean anything by it. I just never took it seriously. Now, I wish I had. It's been almost a year since Sarah died. I still don't know how to talk about it. I don't talk about it, really. I just packed up the RV one day and decided to drive to get away from everything. Her voice, her smile, the way she used to look at me when I'd roll my eyes at her hippie nonsense. It was all too much to deal with, so I left. I wasn't running from her memory exactly. More like I was trying to outrun the guilt that came with it. Sarah always wanted to visit the desert, especially the Navajo Nation. She said Monument Valley was one of the most spiritual places in the world. I never took her. Work got in the way, or my cynicism did. Either way, it never happened. And now, with nothing but miles of empty road ahead of me, I found myself driving right into that part of the world. Maybe it was my way of making up for it. The landscape around me was beautiful in an eerie, desolate way. Massive red rocks rising out of the desert, mesas silhouetted against the setting sun. The kind of place that made you feel small, insignificant. I parked the RV in a remote spot off an unmarked dirt road, no other campers around, just the endless stretch of desert and the towering rock formations in the distance. It was quiet, peaceful, even. I thought maybe I'd finally get a decent night's sleep. I stepped out and walked a bit around the RV, taking in the silence. The air was cool, the sky already darkening with the stars beginning to shimmer into view. Sarah would have loved it. As I sat by the small campfire I'd built poking at the flames, I thought I heard something in the distance. A howl, maybe. Coyotes. I figured it was nothing unusual in a place like this, but the sound was strange. More like a scream than an animal call. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind. Still, it gnawed at me. Something about the isolation felt different tonight. Heavier. I tried to shake the feeling and headed back into the RV. I locked the door out of habit, but deep down, I knew a lock wouldn't help me feel safe. Not tonight. The first sign that something wasn't right came early the next morning. I'd been outside sipping my coffee and watching the sun rise over the desert when I noticed the tracks. Big, too big to be a coyote. Canine-like, sure, but the prints were deeper, more defined, and there were too many of them. They were circling the RV in a wide arc. I crouched down to get a closer look. The spacing was wrong, like whatever had made them had a stride far longer than any normal animal. I shook my head. Probably a wolf, I reasoned, even though they weren't supposed to roam this part of the desert. Or maybe a large dog from a nearby ranch. Either way, I wasn't about to get spooked over some tracks. I spent the day hiking, like taking in the massive rock formations and the endless red sands. The wind carried whispers through the valleys, but I ignored it. I refused to let my mind play tricks on me. This was supposed to be my reset, my chance to process everything and finally move on. But that night, as the firelight flickered in front of me, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. The coyotes started up again. At least I assumed they were coyotes. But the howls were different this time. Longer, more drawn out, closer. I told myself it was nothing. Tried to focus on the crackling fire, but the unease crept in anyway. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement on the ridge not far from the RV. A figure, tall, humanoid, but wrong somehow. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like it didn't quite know how to walk. I blinked, and it was gone. Swallowed by the shadows. My heart raced. I stood, trying to peer into the darkness. But there was nothing out there, just empty desert. The howl stopped, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. I doused the fire quickly and retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. I laughed at myself. A grown man terrified by shadows in the night. I was just exhausted, that was all. Grief and exhaustion made you see things that weren't there. I repeated that to myself as I crawled into bed, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me. The next morning, I found more tracks. This time, they weren't just around the RV. They led right up to the windows, pressed deep into the sand, circling the vehicle like a predator stalking its prey. I stared at them, unease curdling in my stomach. These prints were bigger than the ones from yesterday. Deeper, too. Something was out here. Something that was getting bolder. I decided to leave. That morning, I packed up my things, double-checked the tires on the RV, and set the GPS for the nearest town. But as soon as I hit the ignition, the engine sputtered. It wouldn't start. "Come on, not now," I muttered, trying again. Nothing. I went outside to check the engine, hoping it was something simple, but when I popped the hood, everything looked fine. There was no reason for the RV to stall like this. Yet, there I was, stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no cell signal and no way to leave. As the day wore on, that strange feeling of being watched never left. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd catch sight of that figure again, but the desert was still dead quiet. That night, it came closer. I heard it long before I saw it. Footsteps outside the RV, soft at first, but growing heavier, more deliberate. Something was walking around, pacing as if deciding what to do next. I stayed perfectly still inside, listening as the footsteps circled the RV, stopping near the windows. Then came the scratching. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping against the side of the RV, but the sound was too methodical. It came in short bursts, like claws dragging across metal, testing the strength of the walls. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window, slowly pulling back the curtain just an inch. My breath caught in my throat. There, outside in the dark, was the figure I had seen on the ridge. But it was clearer now, standing in the moonlight, just feet from the RV. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. It looked like a man, but its limbs were wrong. Too long, too thin. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its face, it was shifting, contorting, flickering between the face of a man and that of a coyote. It stopped scratching and turned toward the window, as if it could sense me watching. Its eyes, yellow and gleaming, locked onto mine for a moment. Time seemed to freeze. Then it bared its teeth in a sickening grin. I staggered back, heart pounding in my chest, and stumbled toward the door. I had to get out, had to run, but as soon as my hand reached for the latch, I heard it. Mark. I froze. Mark, it's me. The voice, it was Sarah's. Soft, familiar, and filled with the love I hadn't heard in almost a year. I turned slowly, staring at the window. The figure outside had disappeared, but the voice lingered, echoing in the night. Mark, come outside, please. I shook my head, tears burning in my eyes. No, it couldn't be. It was impossible. Sarah was gone. She was gone. But the voice, it sounded so real. I pressed my hands to my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. No, I whispered. No, no, no. The voice grew louder, more insistent. Mark, come to me. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the scratching returned. More violent this time, as if the creature was trying to claw its way inside. But I didn't open the door. I didn't go outside. The next morning, everything was quiet. No scratches, no footsteps, no voice. I stepped outside, and the desert was calm again. The tracks erased by the wind. The RV started without a hitch. I drove away from Monument Valley, leaving the cursed land behind. But the memory of that night, the voice of my wife, the creature in the dark, has followed me ever since. Some things can't be explained. Some things, I realize now, should never be disturbed. I'm not sure why I chose the Ocala National Forest. It wasn't really on my radar until a couple of weeks ago. Maybe it's because Megan always talked about it, how beautiful the pine forests were, the springs. She was the nature person, not me. She practically begged me to take her camping here once, back when we were still together. I kept putting it off, using work as an excuse. Now, here I am, in the middle of the forest, alone in my RV, with nothing but my thoughts for company. I needed a break. That's what my doctor said. Unplug, he told me. You need to find yourself again, as if I ever had a real grasp of who I was to begin with. 2 weeks into my forced time off, I wasn't any closer to finding peace or clarity. I felt off. I didn't realize how addicted I was to being connected. No emails, no social media, no news feeds, just silence and isolation. It was what I thought I wanted. The first night in the RV wasn't too bad. I parked in a secluded spot far from the main road, surrounded by towering pine trees. I managed to set up camp without any major problems. I had a fire going, and for a little while I could almost see the appeal Megan always talked about. There was something peaceful about the forest, about the stillness. But it was the kind of stillness that quickly became unsettling when you were alone. By the time the sun set, the silence had grown thick. The only sound was the wind shifting through the pine needles, and every so often the distant call of an owl. I tried to read one of the survival books I'd brought, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to her, Megan. We hadn't spoken since the divorce went through. 3 years of marriage dissolved in less than a month. I couldn't even tell you exactly when things went wrong. I just buried myself in work. She begged me to slow down, to reconnect, but I didn't listen. I told myself I was doing it for us, that the stress was worth it in the end. But by the time I realized how much I'd lost, it was too late. The fire crackled as the temperature dropped. I got up to grab my jacket from inside the RV. That's when I first heard it, a soft tapping sound, like something lightly knocking against the side of the RV. I froze, listening. Tap, tap, tap. I leaned against the door, listening harder. The tapping continued, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, scanning the area around the RV. The light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Just trees and shadows. Probably just a branch in the wind, I muttered to myself, though the trees weren't close enough to the RV for that to make sense. I shut the door and locked it. The tapping had stopped, but I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I drifted off, I heard something. Footsteps, rustling things I couldn't explain away as easily as I wanted to. But when I looked outside, the forest was still. The next morning, I found the footprints. They were in the dirt around the RV, large and oddly spaced. Not animal tracks, but not quite human either. They seemed too long, too wide, like someone had been walking on the balls of their feet with unnatural precision. They circled the RV, stopping near the windows before disappearing into the trees. I crouched down to get a better look. The prints were deep, the kind that didn't come from a person casually walking. Whoever or whatever had made them was heavy, deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though there was no one around. I considered leaving, but I wasn't going to let some footprints freak me out. Besides, my RV wouldn't start. No matter how many times I turned the key, the engine just sputtered and clicked. The GPS on my phone was glitchy too, pointing me in all sorts of random directions before it finally went blank. Great, just great. I spent most of the day walking, trying to calm my nerves. I stuck to the trails at first, but as the hours passed, I wandered deeper into the forest. The pine trees stretched up endlessly, their trunks so straight and uniform that I started losing track of where I was. I didn't mind being lost, not at first. It distracted me from the unease that had settled in my chest. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. Someone, standing just beyond the trees. I stopped dead, staring at the figure. It was tall. Too tall and unnaturally still. I blinked, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, but when I looked again, it was still there. A dark shape, humanoid but wrong, standing among the trees, watching me. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the forest. The figure didn't move. I took a step toward it, and in an instant, it vanished. Not like it walked away, just gone, like it was never there. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the spot where the figure had been, before I finally turned and hurried back toward the RV. That night, the tapping started again. Louder this time, more insistent. I lay in bed, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The rhythmic tapping echoed around the RV, coming from all sides. It sounded like someone or something was circling the vehicle, knocking at the walls, at the windows. I couldn't bring myself to move. Then, the footsteps started. Heavy, deliberate thuds like boots crunching on gravel. They moved slowly, methodically, pacing back and forth outside the RV. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking, and crawled out of bed. "Stop it," I whispered to myself. "You're imagining things." "It's nothing." But I wasn't imagining it. I peered through the window, and there it was. The figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. Its shape was clearer now. A tall, gaunt figure with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. I stumbled back from the window, heart racing. The tapping grew more frantic, the footsteps louder. My head spun with fear and confusion. What was it? Why was it here? I bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a voice. "David." I froze. It was Megan's voice, soft, familiar, and unmistakable. "David, come outside." My breath caught in my throat. "Megan?" I whispered, barely able to speak. "Come to me." I stared at the door, my hand trembling on the latch. The voice was so clear, so real. Megan wasn't here. She couldn't be. It wasn't her. "David, please." The voice grew more insistent, more urgent, but something in the tone was wrong. Off. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping and footsteps stopped all at once, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the forest felt different, lighter somehow. The figure was gone, and the RV started on the first try. I didn't waste any time. I packed up and drove away, leaving the forest behind as quickly as I could. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me. That maybe, just maybe, I didn't leave it behind. Some things can't be explained. Some things, I realize now, are better left undisturbed. I thought this trip would fix everything. I thought that a week out in the woods, just me and Tyler would somehow repair the damage from the past year. The divorce hit him harder than it hit me, and that's saying something. I thought maybe out here in the quiet, away from the distractions of phones in the city, we could connect again. Like fathers and sons are supposed to. But from the moment we hit the road, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Tyler barely looked up from his phone the entire drive, earbuds in, scrolling mindlessly. He didn't care about the scenery, didn't care that we were headed to Deadwood Creek, a place I used to go with my own dad when I was his age. It's funny how history repeats itself. My father and I never really saw eye to eye either. He'd brought me out here hoping to teach me how to be a man, how to survive in the wilderness. And now, here I was, doing the same with Tyler, hoping the Black Hills would heal something in both of us. I glanced at him as we pulled into the campground. He didn't even notice the tall, dark pines surrounding us, swaying lightly in the wind. A dense fog had settled over the creek, and the sound of water trickling nearby was the only noise besides the RV's engine. It felt different than I remembered, more isolated, lonelier. "This is it," I said, more to myself than to Tyler. "Cool," he mumbled, still scrolling, not even looking up. I sighed, cutting the engine. After we set up camp, I suggested a short hike to check out the creek. Tyler grumbled but followed me. The trail was just as I remembered, narrow, winding through the trees, with the creek gurgling beside us. There was something peaceful about it, but also something off. The further we went, the heavier the air felt, like the forest was watching us. We reached the creek's edge, where the water ran fast over the rocks. I crouched down, letting the cool water run over my hand. "This place used to be full of miners back in the gold rush days," I said, trying to make conversation. "A lot of people came out here looking to strike it rich. Some of them didn't make it out." Tyler shrugged. "I guess," he said. I stood up and brushed off my hands, frustrated. You could try enjoying this." He looked up from his phone for the first time and scowled. "I didn't ask to come here." I bit my tongue, holding back the argument that wanted to burst out. "Let's head back to camp." As we turned to leave, something flickered in my peripheral vision. I stopped, squinting through the trees. There, just at the edge of the clearing, a dim light floated in the distance. It flickered like a lantern, swaying in the wind. "Did you see that?" I asked, pointing toward the trees. Tyler glanced up, following my gaze. "What? That light?" It was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Maybe I'd imagined it. The fog had thickened while we were by the creek, and the woods were growing darker. Never mind. Let's go. The first night was when things started getting weird. Tyler and I had retreated to the RV after dinner. He was predictably glued to his phone while I tried to read a book, but the quiet gnawed at me. The stillness outside felt oppressive rather than peaceful. The wind had picked up, and the pines swayed ominously against the backdrop of the night. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a soft, barely there sound like whispers carried on the breeze. But as I listened, it grew more distinct. Not the wind, voices. Faint, disembodied voices murmuring just outside the RV. "Did you hear that?" I asked, sitting up straighter. "What?" Tyler didn't even look up. "The voices outside." Tyler pulled out one of his earbuds, frowning. "What are you talking about?" I stood up and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing but fog and trees. But I could still hear the whispers, just at the edge of hearing, like they were coming from the creek. I shook my head. Probably just the wind. Tyler rolled his eyes and went back to his phone, but something about those whispers unsettled me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, the air felt even heavier. Tyler was still distant, sulking around camp, so I suggested another hike, hoping it would clear the tension between us. He reluctantly agreed, and we set off down the trail again, heading back toward the creek. But this time, the unease I'd felt the day before was stronger. Every rustle in the trees, every crack of a branch set me on edge. As we walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was constant now, like eyes were following us from the shadows. Then I saw it again. The light. This time it was brighter, flickering between the trees ahead of us, moving slowly like a lantern being carried by an unseen hand. "There it is," I whispered, grabbing Tyler's arm. "Do you see it?" He stopped, frowning. What? What are you talking about? The light flickered in and out, growing dimmer before vanishing completely. I took a step forward, but Tyler grabbed my arm. Dad, let's just go back. I wanted to argue, but the look on his face, the fear in his eyes, stopped me. Truth be told, I was scared too. Yeah, let's go. That night, the footsteps started. It was late, maybe past midnight, and I just managed to drift off when I heard them. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching on the gravel outside the RV. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the steps were too heavy, too purposeful. I lay there, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps circled the RV. They stopped by the window, then moved to the door. Tyler stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake. I slipped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept toward the window, slowly pulling back the curtain. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, and there, just at the edge of the light, stood a figure. It was tall, dressed in ragged, old-fashioned clothes, like something out of the Gold Rush era. A wide-brimmed hat covered most of its face, but I could see the gleam of a lantern hanging from its hand. The figure stood perfectly still, just watching the RV. I stumbled back, heart racing. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, but I couldn't find one. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the fog, the light of its lantern disappearing with it. The next day, Tyler was pale and jittery, his usual teenage indifference replaced with genuine fear. He hadn't seen the figure, but he'd heard the footsteps, and the look in his eyes told me he knew something was wrong. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "I know," I replied. "I'll start the RV. We'll head out." But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine sputtered, then went silent. I tried again and again, but the RV wouldn't start. "We're stuck here," I muttered, feeling the weight of dread settle over me. That night, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, more insistent. The figure was back, pacing around the RV, dragging something behind it. I could hear the heavy scrape of metal on gravel, like chains being dragged along the ground. "Dad, what is that?" Tyler whispered, his face pale with fear. I didn't have an answer. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped toward the door. "Stay inside," I told him. "No, don't go out there," he begged, grabbing my arm. But I couldn't just sit there, listening to the thing outside. I had to confront it. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. The figure was there, standing by the creek, its lantern casting an eerie glow over the water. It didn't move as I approached, just watched me with shadowed eyes. "What do you want?" I shouted, though my voice trembled. "What are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly lifted its arm, pointing to the ground near the water's edge. There, half buried in the mud, was an old, rusted gold pan. I didn't understand at first, but then it hit me. The legend, the miner's ghost protecting his lost fortune. I knelt down, my hands trembling, and lifted the pan from the mud. As soon as I touched it, the figure vanished. The footsteps stopped. The whispers and the wind fell silent. The air was lighter. The oppressive weight lifted. I stood there for a long time, holding the gold pan, my mind racing. Then, without looking back, I turned and went back to the RV. The next morning, the RV started without a hitch. We left Deadwood Creek behind, and neither of us spoke about what happened. But as we drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure watching us from the trees. I didn't, but I knew, deep down, that something had happened out there. Something I couldn't explain. Something I would never forget. And maybe, just maybe, Tyler and I would be okay. The mist rolled in quicker than I'd expected, but I didn't mind. I loved the fog, loved the way it muted everything, softened the edges of the world, made it all feel a little more mysterious. It was perfect for my project. Whispers of the Wild was going to be my best work yet. I could feel it after everything I'd been through in the past year. Hell, in the past month. This was the reset I needed. Just me, my camera, and the Smoky Mountains. No one to answer to. No one to lean on. Just the way I liked it. I hefted my backpack higher on my shoulders and adjusted my camera strap. The trail was rough, more overgrown than I'd expected, but that was part of the draw. The more remote the location, the better the shot. No tourists ruining the landscape with their neon jackets or loud conversations, just untouched wilderness. But untouched wilderness had its downsides. My camera had been acting up since I'd arrived. I'd missed some great shots because of it. Fog rolling over the peaks, a hawk perched on a branch just feet away. But I told myself I didn't care. This trip wasn't about getting everything right. It was about getting away. I paused to catch my breath and set the camera down on a fallen log. The lens fogged up almost instantly in the damp air, and when I wiped it off with the corner of my jacket, I realized I'd smeared dirt across it. Typical. "Come on," I muttered, digging into my bag for a lens cloth. As I crouched there, rubbing at the stubborn streak of mud, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker. There were plenty of them around these parts, but it didn't sound right. Too slow, too steady. Tap, pause, tap, pause. I looked up, but the fog was thickening, swallowing the trees just a few yards ahead of me. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was just a branch knocking against a tree in the wind. I wasn't scared of being out here alone. In fact, I preferred it. No one to distract me, no one to get in my head. Still, the silence that followed felt too quiet, like something was waiting. I shoved the lens cloth back into my pack and stood up, forcing myself to move on. I had a campsite to reach before dark, and I wasn't about to get spooked by a weird noise. At least not this early in the trip. The fog never really lifted by the time I reached the clearing where I planned to camp. It was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. I set up my tent quickly, more out of habit than anything else, though I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I wasn't sure why. There was no one around, no animals scurrying through the underbrush, not even a bird call to break the stillness. I figured a good night's sleep would shake off the nerves. I was just tired. The last few months had been brutal. Breaking up with Paul, the constant fights before it, the way he made me feel like I couldn't do anything right. This trip was supposed to be my way of proving him wrong. Proving to myself that I didn't need him, that I didn't need anyone. But the anxiety crept up on me anyway, a tight knot in my chest as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of my tent. Then there was that tapping again, faint and far off. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, just the wind, just the forest. But then it stopped abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch, and I heard something else, something worse, a whisper. It was so faint I could barely make it out, but it was there, threading through the fog outside. It didn't sound like words, not exactly, but it was too rhythmic to be wind, too deliberate. I sat up, listening hard, my heart racing. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it through the thin walls of the tent. Just mist and shadows. The whispering stopped, but the silence that followed felt alive, thick with something I couldn't name. I switched off the light, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I just wanted to get moving. The fog had lifted slightly, but the forest felt wrong somehow, like it was holding its breath. I didn't like it. I wanted to get to higher ground, get some better shots, and move on. By midday, I'd made it to a rocky ridge that overlooked a valley. It was beautiful, exactly the kind of shot I'd come for. The fog clung to the trees below, creating a sea of white with the mountain peaks poking through like islands. I snapped a few photos, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. When I reviewed the pictures on my camera, my breath caught in my throat. There were figures in the fog. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just shadows cast by the trees. But the more I zoomed in, the clearer they became. Tall, thin shapes, barely visible but definitely there. Human, or something like it, standing motionless among the trees, watching me. I whipped my head around, scanning the valley below. There was no one, just mist and trees. But in the photos, the figures were there. I lowered the camera, heart pounding. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have. And yet, the air around me felt suddenly cold. Not the kind of cold that comes with a change in the weather. This was different. Deeper, like it had seeped into my bones. I should have left right then, packed up, and headed back to the main trail. But I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping me here, pulling me deeper into the wilderness. That night, I camped by a small stream. I hadn't seen any more figures, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. I felt like I was being watched constantly. Every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I built a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and tried to distract myself by reviewing the day's photos. That's when I noticed something else. The figures in the fog weren't in just one picture. They were in all of them. Some barely visible, others clearer, standing in groups or alone, always watching, always there. My hand started shaking, and I nearly dropped the camera. It was impossible. I'd been out there for hours, and I hadn't seen anyone. Not a single hiker, no animals, no birds. But there they were, in every shot. Suddenly, the whispering started again. It was louder this time, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The beam of light cut through the mist, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the whispering grew louder, like it was circling me, coming from all directions at once. You shouldn't be here. That's what it sounded like. A woman's voice, soft but firm, blending with the rustling leaves and flowing water. It wasn't clear, not exactly, but the meaning was clear. I wasn't welcome. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest and back toward the tent. The whispering followed me, growing sharper, angrier. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second I saw her. She stood at the edge of the trees, tall and thin, dressed in old, ragged clothes. Her face was pale, hollow-eyed, and filled with sorrow. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. The flashlight flickered back to life, and the whispering stopped.
I've always loved the quiet. That's the real reason I camp alone and hike alone. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about the silence. The kind of silence that presses against you like a weight, smoothing out the chaos of everyday life. Out here, far from deadlines and the blaring traffic, I can hear my own thoughts. But it's a fragile thing. The peace that the wilderness offers. I've learned that the quiet can also play tricks on you, turn on you. That's what happened to me in the San Juan National Forest. I'd been camping alone plenty of times before, but this trip was different. I still have trouble putting it into words. All I know is that the silence stopped being my friend somewhere on the second day. I'd planned to be out there for 4 days, just long enough to clear my head and reset. The spot I'd picked was remote, a stretch of dense forest near Pagosa Springs that even the locals didn't visit often. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first day went like it always does. The drive up was uneventful, and after a few hours of hiking, I found the perfect campsite. It was tucked away by a creek, surrounded by towering pines, with a small clearing just big enough for my tent and fire pit. I felt that familiar rush of excitement as I set up camp, the freedom of being out here completely alone, with nothing but wilderness around me. That first night was easy. I sat by the fire, listening to the water rush over the rocks in the creek. I wrote in my journal a bit, mostly just notes about the hike and some thoughts about work. Then I crawled into my tent, ready to sleep. The silence was comforting at first, as it always is, but I woke up in the middle of the night to something strange. It was subtle, just a faint whispering sound, like the wind picking up through the trees. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day, things started to go wrong. I woke up later than I'd planned, the sky already a pale blue overhead. My stove was acting up, which was weird because it had worked fine the night before. It just wouldn't light, no matter what I tried. I ended up eating cold granola and packing up my camp, ready to move deeper into the forest. That's when I noticed my GPS wasn't working. I'd had reception when I camped here before, but now my phone was useless, no signal at all. I wasn't worried yet, though. I'd brought a map, and I knew the area well enough to navigate without technology. Still, the feeling that something wasn't right settled in, and I couldn't shake it. The hike was harder than I expected. My legs felt heavier, like the air itself was weighing me down, and the forest was quiet, too quiet. Normally you'd hear birds or the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, but today it was just still. The silence felt unnatural. I found another campsite by late afternoon, a little further into the woods next to a meadow that looked untouched. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get a fire going, But as I worked, the feeling of being watched crept up on me. I couldn't shake it. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, nothing was there, just trees and shadows, but the sensation wouldn't leave. That night, I heard the whispers again. This time, they were louder, clearer, and they weren't random. They were saying something, my name. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable, drifting on the breeze from somewhere just beyond the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight, thus unzipped the tent and shone the light into the trees. Nothing. The forest was still, the fire flickering in the corner of my vision. I stood there for a long time listening, but the whispering had stopped. It was just the wind. It had to be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the third day, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept much the night before, and the feeling of unease had only grown stronger. My gear wasn't cooperating either. When I tried to pack up my tent, I found that the poles had bent. They were new, barely used, but somehow they were warped like something had twisted them while I slept. It didn't make sense. The whispering was back too, even during the day. It followed me as I hiked, a faint sound on the edge of hearing, like someone walking just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I wasn't alone out here. Then there was the whistling. It started around midday, just after I'd set up my third camp. At first I thought it was a bird, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, a high, clear note that echoed through the trees. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I called out, hoping it was another hiker, someone who stumbled across my camp, but there was no response, just silence. I tried to stay calm, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Now, it felt like something was circling me, just beyond my vision, waiting. That night, the whispers didn't stop. I lay in my tent, wide awake, listening as the sound of my name drifted through the trees. It was faint at first, like it had been the night before, but as the hours passed, it grew louder, more insistent. Dylan. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The fire had died down, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. I scanned the trees, heart racing, but there was nothing, just darkness. I was about to crawl back into my tent when I saw something move, a shadow slipping between the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was too big to be an animal, and it was moving too deliberately, like it was watching me, waiting. I turned off my flashlight and backed into the tent, my mind racing. I'd never been this scared in the woods before, not once in all the years I'd camped alone. But now, there was something out there. I could feel it. I zipped the tent shut and tried to calm my breathing, but the whispers were inside my head now. They weren't just outside, they were all around me. Dylan, Dylan. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my tent, clutching the flashlight, listening as the whispers circled me. Sometimes it sounded like one voice, sometimes several, but it was always the same soft, insistent calling my name. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get out of these woods. But as I started hiking, the whistling began again. This time it was closer, following me like something was walking just behind me, whistling a slow, eerie tune. I didn't stop to look. I didn't want to see whatever it was. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until I was practically running down the trail. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, and slowly turned around. There, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, and its lips were curled into a grin. It stood there, staring at me, its head cocked to the side as if amused. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The whistling had stopped, and now there was only silence, a silence so thick it pressed down on me like a weight. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually I turned and ran. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were going to burst. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead where my car was parked. When I finally looked back, the figure was gone. I never told anyone what happened in the San Juan National Forest. Not really. I tried to explain it to myself 1,000 different ways. Exhaustion, anxiety, maybe even altitude sickness. But none of that explains the whispers or the whistling or the figure that watched me from the trees. I haven't been camping since. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as though the forest was holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I had heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps, one that locals said disappeared and reappeared as though it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it and film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera and set it up, filming a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on the damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket, just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore were fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in symbols, strange spiraling shapes that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving, the trees closing in tighter. The trail I was following became fainter, more overgrown, and soon it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping my camera rolling, but after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment there had been a clear path, and now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. The mist curled around the trees, thick and almost suffocating, but I was certain I'd been on the right trail. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed that I was in the middle of nowhere. No path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me, standing alone in the fog. Okay, I muttered. You've dealt with worse. I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I froze, listening. The sound came from deeper in the forest, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then, out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. "Hey," I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. "You lost too?" The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. "I've been walking for days," he said, his voice hoarse. "The trail? It keeps changing." "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. "No one's okay out here." I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path. It's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave." I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. "Look," I said, pulling out my GPS. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get him some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago was now choked with brambles. When I looked back, the trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees. Thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and then the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Eli nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us, the forest." I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside. Water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around as though he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the whispers growing louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen, shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me, the fog so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. Not in this forest. Not sitting in this RV, staring at the tall trees outside, wondering if this trip would be my last. Fort Pino National Forest had been Karen's idea years ago. She had this way of looking at the world, seeing the beauty in everything. She wanted to camp here, hike the trails, soak in the stillness of the ancient trees. I didn't get it then, too caught up in work, too busy to care. But now it was all I had left. It had been a year since she died, and I still couldn't make sense of it. A car accident on a quiet street, just like that, she was gone. And I was left stumbling through life, trying to figure out how to exist without her. This trip was my last attempt at finding something, anything that made sense. So here I was, parked deep in the middle of nowhere, hoping that the forest would somehow offer answers. I didn't know what else to do. The trees stretched up into the sky, their thick trunks casting shadows that lingered even in the daylight. It was beautiful in a way, but it felt empty without her. I could almost hear her voice telling me to look at the wildflowers or marvel at the way the sunlight filtered through the branches. I stepped out of the RV. The cool, damp air wrapped around me. The scent of pine and moss was thick, earthy. Everything seemed so alive, and yet all I could feel was the weight of the past pressing down on me. I started a small fire, just like I'd done the past few nights, and sat there, watching the flames dance. The crackling wood was the only sound in the stillness. That's when I heard it, footsteps. They were faint, barely audible over the fire, but distinct enough to make me stand up, heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing, just shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe some other animal, but the feeling stuck, the sense that someone was watching me. I wasn't alone. I sat back down, trying to shake the unease, but it lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about the old man I'd met the day before. Edgar. He'd been wandering the campground when I arrived, his wrinkled face covered in a scruffy beard, eyes sharp despite his age. He was friendly enough, but there had been something off about him. "You came at the wrong time," he'd said, staring at me with a knowing look. "Why is that?" I'd asked, brushing it off. "Some things shouldn't be disturbed, especially at night. The forest, it has its secrets." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't respond. But his words stuck with me, replaying in my mind as I sat by the fire. What did he mean by secrets? What was he talking about? I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, sitting in the dark, with the fire flickering low, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to what he'd said. The wind picked up, making the trees sway, their branches creaking overhead. The fire sputtered as the breeze caught it, and I stood up again, feeling restless. I needed to move, to walk, anything to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the forest, just far enough to feel like I was doing something. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the trees, but casting long shadows everywhere else. My footsteps were the only sound now, crunching softly on the forest floor. I don't know how far I walked before I saw the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a spiral-like shape that looked old, weathered by time. I crouched down, running my fingers over it. It was smooth, unnaturally so, like it had been carved recently. I stood up, shining the light around, and spotted more symbols carved into the trees at odd intervals. Spirals, faces, shapes that made no sense. They all seemed to be pointing deeper into the forest, like a trail leading me somewhere. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back, trying to ignore the nagging curiosity that pulled at me. I wasn't here to chase after strange carvings. I was here to, well, I didn't know why I was here anymore, but this wasn't it. As I made my way back toward the RV, the air seemed heavier, colder. I couldn't hear the wind anymore, and the shadows seemed darker. The feeling that I was being watched returned, stronger this time, like someone or something was following me. My pulse quickened, and I picked up the pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. Nothing, just trees and shadows. When I reached the RV, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The fire had gone out, leaving nothing but smoldering embers. I climbed inside, locked the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed, heart still racing. I was just tired. That's all it was. The grief, the isolation, it was messing with my head. I hadn't been sleeping well, and the loneliness had a way of playing tricks on the mind. At least that's what I told myself. The next morning, I met Leah. She was hiking near the campground, a pack slung over her shoulders, looking every bit the confident outdoors woman. She was friendly, outgoing, and struck up a conversation with me as soon as we crossed paths. "You camping out here alone?" she asked, her voice light, casual. I nodded. "Yeah, needed some time away, I guess." "I get that," she said, smiling. "This place is something else. It's beautiful, but it can get a little weird at night, don't you think?" I paused, remembering the footsteps, the carvings, Edgar's warnings. "Weird?" I asked. "How strange it can feel out here after dark. Just stories, old legends. You know how it is with places like this. Every forest has its ghost stories." I tried to keep my tone neutral, but the unease from the night before still lingered. She smiled again, but this time there was something in her eyes, like she knew more than she was letting on. "Just be careful. It's easy to get lost out here," she said. With that, she waved and continued down the trail, disappearing into the trees. I watched her go, wondering if I should have said more, asked her what she meant, but I didn't. I spent the rest of the day at camp, trying to relax, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. That night, as I sat by the fire again, I couldn't stop thinking about the symbols. They'd seemed so deliberate, so purposeful, like someone or something was trying to lead me deeper into the woods. And then the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the trees, but saw nothing, just shadows. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the RV, slow, deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. My throat tightened as I strained to listen, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, but the footsteps didn't answer. Instead, they stopped. Dead silence. I backed toward the RV, fumbling for the door when I saw it. Movement just at the edge of the trees. A figure, tall, thin, but barely visible in the darkness. I blinked and it was gone. I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in short gasps. The next morning, Leah was gone. Her tent was still there, her pack sitting neatly outside, but she was nowhere to be found. I searched the area, calling her name, but the forest was silent. I left Fort Pino the next morning, the RV's engine sputtering to life as I drove away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The forest had its secrets. I wasn't meant to know them. I thought the desert would heal me. Red Rock Canyon was supposed to be a place to clear my head, to sit in silence and let the vast, empty land take away the chaos of the last few months. I'd lost everything, my wife, my job, and I needed something, anything, to remind me there was still some peace left in the world. Instead, it felt like I'd driven into a nightmare. I parked the RV at the far end of the campground, as far away from the few other campers as I could get. I wanted solitude, to think, or maybe to stop thinking. I wasn't sure. The sun was setting as I stepped out, casting a deep orange glow across the red sandstone cliffs. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that made you feel small, like the world was too big for you to matter. Maybe that's what I needed. I'd been driving for hours with only the occasional crackle of the radio for company. The RV was old, creaking and groaning as I navigated the winding roads into the canyon. It had seen better days, much like me. As I stretched, a low rumble came from under the hood. "Great," I muttered, giving the RV a half-hearted kick. The engine had been acting up for days, but I figured I could deal with it later. I wasn't here for that. I was here to get away, to let the emptiness of the desert swallow me whole. That night, after I'd settled in, I sat outside the RV, staring up at the stars. Out here, away from the city, the sky was incredible, clear, endless. But as the stars twinkled overhead, I noticed something strange. At first I thought they were planes, blinking in and out far above the canyon. But then they moved too fast, too erratically. I leaned forward, squinting. There were 3 of them, glowing faintly blue, darting through the sky in impossible patterns. They weren't planes. I wasn't sure what they were. I stood up, straining my neck to follow their path as they circled overhead. They blinked off one by one, and the desert was silent again. Just stars, I told myself, even though I knew it wasn't true. The next morning, I woke up to find the RV's battery almost dead. My phone, which I'd left charging overnight, hadn't gained a single bar. I tried turning the engine over, but all I got was a dull click. My chest tightened. Being stranded in the middle of the desert wasn't part of the plan. I had enough food and water for a few days, sure, but the isolation was starting to feel less like a retreat and more like a trap. Milo's RV was parked a few spots down, his beat-up rig sitting in the shade of a large rock formation. He waved me over as I stepped out of mine, a wide grin on his sunburnt face. "Morning," he called. "Beautiful day, huh?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure. Hey, you wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" Milo scratched his scruffy chin, then shook his head. "Sorry, friend, but I can give you a ride into town later if you need help. It's not too far." I thanked him, but something about Milo unsettled me. Maybe it was how relaxed he seemed, like this place wasn't bothering him at all. As I stood there, he tilted his head toward the canyon walls. "You see the lights last night?" he asked. I froze. "Yeah, what were they?" He shrugged, like it was nothing. "Oh, those things. People talk about them all the time. Could be military, could be something else. No one really knows, but they've been around as long as I've been camping out here." I laughed nervously. "Something else, huh?" Milo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "People say they're not from this world. I don't know about that, but sometimes they follow you. Just don't go too far out at night and you'll be fine." I forced another laugh, but my stomach churned. Milo's tone was too casual, too accepting. I thanked him again and went back to my RV, trying to shake off the feeling that I was missing something important. The day dragged on, the heat baking the ground beneath my feet. I spent the afternoon hiking a short trail near the campground, trying to clear my head, but the vast emptiness only made me feel more alone. I kept thinking about the lights, about how they'd moved, how they seemed to watch me. That night, they returned. I was sitting outside again, nursing a warm beer and staring at the sky when I saw them. 3 faint blue lights hovering over the canyon. This time, they were closer, too close. They flickered almost playfully, darting back and forth like they were searching for something. I stood up, my heart pounding. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this place made sense. I backed toward the RV, never taking my eyes off the lights, but as I reached for the door, the lights blinked out. Gone, just like that. A cold breeze swept through the canyon, and I shivered. It was too quiet. No wind, no insects, nothing, just the dead, suffocating silence of the desert. Then the RV lights flickered once, twice, and went dark. My chest tightened as I stumbled into the RV, fumbling for the flashlight. I clicked it on, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness. The electrical panel was dead, and my phone wouldn't turn on. Every piece of technology I had was failing, and I had no idea why. A sudden knock on the door made me jump. "Chris, you okay?" It was Emily, the hiker I'd met earlier that day. She'd pitched her tent nearby, planning to stay for a few nights before heading out. I opened the door, trying to hide my panic. "Yeah, just some electrical issues," I said, forcing a smile. "Everything's dead. I'm guessing the battery's shot." Emily frowned, glancing back at her tent. "That's weird. My phone's dead too, and my flashlight keeps flickering." Her voice was calm, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She felt it too, the strangeness in the air, the weight of the silence. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you think it's the lights?" Milo told me about them earlier, said people disappear sometimes. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Disappear?" Emily nodded, her gaze drifting toward the canyon. "Yeah, it's mostly stories, but you seemed pretty convinced." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt thick, heavy, like the desert was closing in on us. I wasn't sure if I believed in Milo's campfire tales, but the lights, they were real, and they weren't natural. "We should get out of here," Emily said, breaking the silence. "I don't like this." "I can't," I replied. "My RV won't start." She hesitated, then nodded. "Mine either. I tried earlier, but it's completely dead." We stood there staring at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. Something was wrong with this place. The lights weren't just an oddity. They were doing something, affecting everything around us, and we were stuck miles from any help. "6 months in the Smokies. 6 months. 6 whole months without touching a drop. I should have been proud, right? But sitting alone in this RV deep in the Great Smoky Mountains, I didn't feel proud. I felt restless, empty, even the kind of empty that creeps up on you, settling in your bones when there's nothing but the sound of your own thoughts bouncing around your skull. This trip was supposed to be a celebration, a gift to myself for staying clean. I thought the solitude would help me clear my head, maybe give me some perspective. The Smokies had always been a place of peace for me. My dad used to take me camping here when I was a kid, back when life was simple, before the bottle got its hooks into me. I pulled out my phone, flicking through pictures of those old trips. My thumb hesitated over the last photo of my dad and me standing by a roaring campfire. That was before everything went to hell, before the drinking became my escape from everything I couldn't face. The phone buzzed, pulling me back to the present. It was my brother Jake, checking in as usual. "Hey, man," he said when I answered. "How's the trip? You hanging in there?" Jake was always the responsible one, clean-cut, married with kids, a steady job. He'd been my lifeline after the wreckage of my addiction. I owed him more than I could ever repay. "Yeah, it's good," I lied. "Just me and the trees. Peaceful." "You staying out of trouble?" I chuckled. "I'm not exactly near any temptations out here," I said. I didn't tell him about the bottle I brought with me. It sat in the back of the RV, unopened but still there, just in case. A cruel comfort. I'd stared at it more than once already, the amber liquid calling to me in the quiet. Good to hear, Jake said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. Just keep your head straight, all right? I know it's tough being out there alone, but you got this. Call me if you need anything. I will. Thanks. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the trees. The sky faded from a soft orange to deep purple, and with it, the familiar sense of isolation began to settle in. The first night in the Smokies should have been serene, but as soon as the darkness took over, I felt it, the unease. The forest around me was too quiet. It was like it was holding its breath. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the faint crackle of my campfire outside. I sat at the picnic table near the fire, trying to relax, but the silence only seemed to grow heavier. I poked at the flames with a stick, hoping they'd somehow keep the stillness at bay. Then I heard it, a whistle, faint at first, like a breeze cutting through the trees, but unmistakably human. I froze, listening. It was tuneless, just a single drawn-out note that seemed to float through the air. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. No movement. No one else was supposed to be this far out. I'd parked in a secluded area of the park, away from the main trails. The whistling continued, soft but constant. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself, but even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded deliberate. I stood, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, and slowly circled the fire. I kept the flames between me and the trees, my eyes darting between the dark shapes of the pines. The whistle came again, louder this time, closer. My heart hammered in my chest, the familiar anxiety clawing its way up my throat. "Who's there?" I called, my voice breaking the thick silence. No response, just another long, drawn-out whistle. I grabbed my flashlight from the RV and swept the beam through the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were shadows. No footsteps, no crunch of leaves, just that damn whistling drifting through the trees like a ghost. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing, right? Just a trick of the wind. The mountains could be strange like that, especially at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The bottle of whiskey in the back of the RV started to look more and more appealing, but I shoved that thought down. I wasn't here for that. Not this time. To clear my head, I went for a hike, following a trail that wound through the dense forest. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. For a while, it worked. I could almost forget about the night before. Almost. That's when I saw the first marking. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a rough, jagged symbol that looked like a spiral or maybe an eye. I couldn't tell. It didn't look natural, though. It felt intentional, like a warning. I ran my fingers over it, the grooves deep and uneven. I kept walking, but the further I went, the more of the symbols I saw. Spirals, faces, strange runes carved into the trees, all leading deeper into the woods. It felt like they were guiding me somewhere, though I wasn't sure I wanted to find out where. That night, the whistling returned. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to keep my mind off the bottle when the sound came drifting through the trees. This time, it wasn't soft. It was louder, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the forest. My heart pounded in my ears. My mouth went dry. The whistling seemed to circle the campsite, moving slowly but deliberately. It was all I could hear, filling the silence like a haunting lullaby. I turned, and that's when I saw him. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure. A man gaunt and pale, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood motionless, his lips pursed as he whistled that same eerie, tuneless note. "Hey!" I called, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. The whistling grew louder, more insistent, cutting through the night air like a knife. I took a step toward him, but as soon as I moved, he turned and disappeared into the trees. My hands were shaking. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, something deeper. I felt the urge to chase him, to follow that haunting sound, but my legs refused to move. I stayed by the fire until dawn, too scared to go back inside the RV. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed up my gear, grabbed the keys to the RV, and decided I'd had enough of the Smokies. But when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over, just a dull click. I swore under my breath, popped the hood, and checked the battery. Everything looked fine, but the damn thing wouldn't start. I tried calling Jake, but my phone was dead. I charged it the night before, but now it was completely drained. No signal, no service, nothing. The forest around me felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting just beyond the trees. The whistling started again, faint at first, then growing louder like a taunting melody. I grabbed the bottle from the back of the RV. I wasn't going to drink it, not yet. But holding it made me feel better, more in control, as if I could use it as a weapon somehow. That night, the stranger came back. I woke up to the sound of whistling, loud, sharp, right outside the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked out the window. He was standing by the fire pit, his pale face illuminated by the flames. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and that awful whistling filled the air, pressing in on me from all sides. He took a step toward the RV, and I felt the panic rise in my chest. I grabbed the bottle, holding it like a club, and stumbled outside. The air was freezing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whistling pierced through my skull, making it hard to think. I raised the bottle, ready to throw it, but then something stopped me. For the first time in days, I heard something else. A voice, faint but real. Jake's voice. "Nick, don't do it." I blinked, shaking my head. The stranger was gone. The whistling had stopped, and there in the silence, I realized what I had been about to do. The bottle slipped from my hands and shattered on the ground. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The whistling was gone, but the fear, the isolation, it wasn't something I could run from. Not out here. Not anywhere. When the sun rose, I tried the RV again. This time it started. I drove out of the Smokies that morning, not looking back. The whistling stayed behind, lost in the trees, but the memory of it, the temptation, would stay with me. 6 months sober. But this trip taught me something I hadn't been ready to face. Some demons don't live in bottles. They live in the silence, in the spaces we create for ourselves when we're trying to hide from the world.